It'd be pretty cool if it does. Okay, so it says we're going live. Let's see if there's an error. It says excellent connection. Last time it said terrible connection, and it didn't work. Uh, all right, seems to be working. So, hello everybody. We have lots of people here. Do you all want to introduce yourselves? Well, I'm here with Exit and Lorem Ipsum and
Hello, everyone.
John.
Hello.
All right. So typically we wait a few minutes for people to join because it seems to be a nice thing to do. But anyways, do any of you have a short story to tell for a moment? Or anything interesting happened today?
Just got off a plane, and I was walking down Third Avenue in New York City earlier, and I got very good luck because a pigeon pooped on me. So that's my story today.
Nice. That's there you go. That's your present for visiting New York. You're welcome. Okay.
So it's a fun city.
Yeah, yeah. Constantine is not here right now. He might come. Who knows? But I just want to say because people are saying hello to Constantine. Constantine's not here. He might be. Who knows? I think he's actually taking a nap, which is something he does like every day at this time of day. So it's like he's kind of like a cat. Constantine's like a cat. So it's just the way he is. Yeah. Today I did not have a good day. I fell very far behind in especially updating the map, but also in just everything. But I do have an updated map somewhat. It's not as updated as I'd like it to be, but it is updated. Uh, the most interesting news, and I'm not going to talk about news so much today because we have another topic to talk about, which I think is more interesting. But the most interesting news today is Ukrainian advance around Robotyne. So, specifically in the east, they appear to have crossed this intersection maybe a week ago. It was hard. It's hard to tell exactly when, but it's not necessarily recent because just south of here we saw Ukraine engaging tanks and destroying them, and now Russia is destroying Ukrainian tanks here, and Ukrainian infantry appear to be somewhere down here. To keep in mind, the terrain here is like a ravine, I guess. I The Russians control all the high ground, which is kind of marked on the map, and Ukraine is kind of moving up a little kind of ridge. I guess I can show this in 3D. So it is here, and you can see that there is kind of this low ground here, and Ukraine is kind of moving along. I don't know if this is a ridge, but whatever. They're kind of moving along kind of the high ground ish, and they've likely crossed this intersection and moving south. So that's kind of the most interesting news today. Beyond that, nothing terribly interesting happened that I know of anyway. There's obviously Ukraine hasn't captured Urozhaine yet, but they're getting really close to. It might be like another 3 days or so before they actually capture it. And beyond that, nothing super interesting happened. There were some map clarifications along this front line, which is near Svatove, and this doesn't represent like changes. It's just clarifications from better information. So this whole front line is different now, but it's not different in a way that it actually matters, and and it's similarly true around this northern area near Kupiansk. But yeah, more or less the front line is stable, which is probably a bad thing, to be honest, considering this is supposedly a large offensive. But at the same time, it's more of an attritional stage of the conflict. But anyways, I guess we can move on to our next topic. I think is more interesting. So Lorem Ipsum is here to talk to us about economics, which
everyone's
is
favorite subject.
which I think is a fascinating topic. And let's go for it.
All right, so I'll keep it brief. I've got more notes I can go into in greater depth if there's a burning need on behalf of you guys in the audience for more economic detail. But so big picture, right? A lot of headlines this week that the USD ruble rate touched 100, which means $1 buys you 100 rubles. The more that graph goes up, the weaker the ruble is getting. Lots of people at the beginning of the invasion, 180, $1 bought you 180 rubles. People were memeing about ruble more like rubble. Subsequently, when the ruble recovered not only to its pre-war level, but all the way down to the low 60s, at one point even the high 50s, that is $1 only bought you 57 rubles. You saw the Vatniks on Twitter going mad saying, oh, ruble's best performing currency in this quarter, sanctions have failed. And my position this whole time has been, guys, this is not a scoreboard. It's an indicator. There's nothing inherently good or bad about a higher or lower general exchange rate. It's not something that, either way, it's a mixed economic blessing. A weak currency is great for exports, but it's terrible for imports. A strong currency is the opposite. And it tends to be self-correcting because, wow, if imports are so expensive, people will stop importing, prices go down. It's self-correcting to some degree. Without going into macroeconomics 101 lecture, which I'm sure nobody on the planet has ever wanted to hear, including macroeconomists, what does this mean in terms of Russia's ability to wage its genocidal war on the Ukrainian people? Like I said, there's nothing inherently good or bad about it being generally weaker or stronger, but there is something unequivocally bad for Russia and thus good for humanity if their currency is seen to be out of control. Because when it comes to economic crises, the most important commodity is not gold or oil or cash, but confidence. So if Russian consumers and sellers or lenders and borrowers fear that unable to control or manage the situation to some reasonable degree, that's when you get vicious cycles that lead to economic catastrophe. Inflation expectations are to some degree self-fulfilling prophecies as they inform market decisions. And if people panic and things get out of control, with prices escalating, or lenders fear the money they lent out is going to be worthless by the time they get it back, this is when you get real panic. So the key indicator here is not so much the ruble rate per se, but it's how does the average Russian feel about the purchasing power of their own currency for their own economic needs. And the dollar-ruble rate is somewhat an indicator of that and is related to that. The weaker the ruble gets in terms of foreign exchange, that does have an inflationary effect on the domestic economy. But the key takeaway is, make no mistake, so long as the Russian government is willing to sacrifice the well-being of its own citizens in pursuit of imperial conquest, it has no shortage of options. A professor at the University of Chicago, quoted in the FT, summed up the situation. The arsenal of financial repression is essentially endless. And that's right. You can put people in jail for buying dollars. You can restrict the ability of companies to convert their foreign exchange receipts. You impose even more draconian capital controls. You can cut state employees' benefits and salaries. You can stop the coffin payments, stop the free lottos. There's any number of repressive means at the Russian government's disposal to control this currency at the expense of their own people and their long-term economic health. But it will patch things over in the short term. And as always, they can always mortgage their future by selling off the crown jewels, at least in part, Gazprom, Rosneft, to Beijing, where they will find a very, very eager buyer. And so it's a question of to what degree is Vladimir Putin willing to further become a vassal of China in pursuit of genocide and imperial conquests? And it's a question with no good answer, unfortunately. That's my opening spiel.
Okay. All right. So there are a few questions that I have. First question is, there's been a lot of conversation about Russia burning through its reserves of foreign cash, like dollars and also gold, I guess. How true is that? What is the state of their reserves at this point?
So at the beginning of this year, the Russian the Duma, which is obviously a rubber stamp body, but let's just say the Kremlin. The Kremlin laid out its use of emergency budget reserves for the year 2023. They said this is how much extra we'll need from raiding the piggy bank, quote unquote. And they burned through 95% of that by March. So they are most definitely raiding their sovereign wealth funds. Their current account surplus has collapsed 85%. So that's the difference between exports and imports, which, when you have state-owned enterprises, directly feeds into the Russian government. So yes, they are burning through their cash incredibly fast. Spending is skyrocketing. That's why you're seeing these inflationary pressures. But they have a lot more things they can sell for a lot of money if they need to. And would it be disastrous for their sovereignty? Yes. Selling off Gazprom and Rosneft to Beijing, selling off specific rights to different natural resources, to different buyers, again, almost certainly Beijing. The point at which the quote-unquote lights go out in Moscow is very, very far away because they have assets they can sell.
Okay. So, Exit, do you have a question?
I did. So you mentioned something like selling Gazprom. I'm not sure how many people understand that, but Gazprom transits a lot of products all across Europe, and still does. Would that not be a security issue for Europe generally if China owned it? And wouldn't Europe want to prevent something like that from happening?
So taking Gazprom. So pre-war Gazprom, it's has businesses all over the world, right? And it is mainly, but not exclusively, natural gas. Rosneft is mainly, but not exclusively, crude oil and refined products. The crown jewel within Gazprom, where it made the vast majority of its money, were its Western Siberian gas fields that fed Europe, both in terms of land pipelines, including those through Ukraine, as well as the now famous Nord Sea 1 and 2 undersea pipelines. At this point, Europe, and when I say Europe, I'm not including Hungary for obvious reasons, has almost completely weaned itself off Gazprom's natural gas deliveries. Gazprom is in a real tough situation here because, unlike oil, which you can just put on a tanker, right? So if Europe stops buying Russian oil, okay, just send the tanker to a different country. It's not seamless, but it's pretty easy. Natural gas, you can't do that. You have LNG terminals, which you can turn it into a liquid, put it on a tanker, and send it to a place that has a terminal to turn it back into a gas. Once you've used up your LNG, liquefied natural gas export capacity, there's nowhere else you can send it unless you build a new pipeline. And that takes a decade, and it takes a lot of money. And they have the pipeline planned. It's Power Siberia 2, and it would link those Western Siberian gas fields to the Chinese market. Right now, the only link to China is for the Far East Siberian, like think near Vladivostok. But the main gas fields have no link to China in terms of pipelines. And the proposed pipeline to link them, Power Siberia 2, when Xi was in Moscow, Putin proposed signing this agreement to start construction and approval on this pipeline, which again would take a decade. And Xi hand-waved him. Oh, there's still further concerns. I remain optimistic. This will be a great project, but no signing on the dotted line. So Russia's ability to monetize its natural gas that it was selling to Europe very profitably is suspended for the better part, if not over a decade. And it's going to take not just time, but a lot of money for them to do that. In terms of security risk, I don't think there's more of a security risk than it being in Russian hands. And I think at some point, if you saw something like a Chinese controlling Gazprom, which was rumored that they were going to take a 20% stake, that was rumored in March 2022, and then was quickly denied by the Kremlin. If that did happen, you're really seeing Russia and China conflating into the same economic entity, at least at that point.
So we have another question, which is it's different. So I don't know if Exit wants to ask a follow up or change the topic a little bit.
I can't find my pipeline map. I was trying to look it up. I thought there was still 2 or 3, or at least one pipeline that was active across Ukraine, but I can't find it and I can't remember off the top of my head. So it's all good. Just move on.
Yeah, there are still small volumes, very, very small volumes, if you compare it to what was flowing through, say, Nord Stream 1, even just 1, and what was proposed to be flowing through Nord Stream 2. And again, I'm not looking at the pipeline map either. But, there's one that still has de minimis deliveries that has a terminus in Slovakia. There is one that connects through to Hungary. And then obviously there was one that I'm not entirely sure this is accurate, but there's part of a network that is in occupied Ukraine, in Donbass, that links to a terminal on actual Russian territory that is related to the sub-Black Sea pipelines that feed primarily Turkey. But there was the proposed one that was going to feed Italy, but that got kiboshed.
Okay. So our other question is, you said yesterday there were support purchases for the ruble, and how much of their foreign currencies did they burn through doing that?
It's a very good question, and one to which I would love to know the answer. However, they stopped telling us, because starting in, I think the first time they started withholding data was in May of 2022. They started suspending some data series, and since then it has just been an escalating process of data that they are no longer publishing, making up different excuses. And even the data they do publish is amalgamated. So they'll say there were this many total outlays, but not saying how they were divided up. And so it's hard to parse. But yesterday, what was interesting, they raised interest rates 3.5% in one day. The Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or the European Central Bank or Bank of Japan will raise interest rates in 0.25% increments, maybe 0.5% at a time, if it's a really dramatic shift in policy. They raised 3.5% in one day, and it had a negligible effect on the ruble's valuation. Most countries, if they were worried, oh my God, our currency's weakening, just raise interest rates, because it's a higher interest rate, more people are going to want to put their money there and earn that higher interest rate. Increases demand, valuation goes back. But it's, people sometimes forget the ruble is really not international currency anymore. There's not really a global currency market for the ruble the way that there was in January 2022. So it wasn't as if you had this huge rush of people moving their money from outside of Russia into Russia. At the end of the day, the reason the ruble's going down is because there's a glut of rubles within Russia that nobody wants, and there's a famine of foreign currency that everybody's trying to get their hands on. And so it's that domestic supply and demand.
Okay. So, John, do you have any questions? I know you have questions.
Yeah, so what I'm most curious about is will and how will the devaluation of the ruble with respect to foreign currencies impact Russia's ability to more or less fund its military industrial complex and ongoing war production?
So the lowercase c conservative answer to that question is not for quite some time, because as I referenced before, the mechanisms of the arsenal of financial repression is almost endless. And so long as you're willing to further ruin the economic welfare of your own people, and so long as you are willing to sell off the economic future of your country for multiple generations, there are a lot of tools at your disposal. And it's important to remember, having a weak currency, like I said before, a weaker versus stronger currency is not necessarily a good or bad thing. It's mixed either way. China grew rich for 2 decades by keeping their currency artificially low. So low the U.S. tried to sue them in court for currency manipulation. It was infuriating America, and it was making China filthy rich by having the yuan so weak versus the U.S. dollar. Because it means that your exports are essentially more competitive. If you're selling oil in dollars and all of a sudden $1 buys you 120 rubles, well, that's more rubles per dollar of oil sales than you were getting before. The bigger fear right now in Russia, and you saw this with Solovyev's comments, and you saw this with some of the other comments coming out in Russian propaganda and on TASS and different editorials, is that there's a fear about inflation, less of a fear about their ability to fund the military-industrial complex. But there's also this emotional attachment to the strength of the ruble. Russia's strong, ruble must be strong. And it is about that basic. It's really not much more sophisticated of an argument than that. Maxim Oreshkin, who is the Grima worm tongue of Putin's economic policy and the arch nemesis of Elvira Nabiullina, the central bank governor, he wrote an editorial in TASS. He goes, "The Russian economy needs a strong ruble." Why? The Chinese economy didn't need a strong yuan. And it's this emotional attachment to, hey, currency strong means Russia strong, that you're seeing play out in a lot of the rhetoric beyond rational macroeconomic reasoning.
Okay. I'm just scanning through the chat for questions at the moment.
I'll say one more thing on John's question, just because it's really funny reading what Oreshkin wrote in his editorial, because it's so contradictory. He's saying, the central bank has all the tools to normalize the situation in the near future and ensure a reduction in the pace of lending to sustainable levels. This is the same crowd that is calling for ever more military measures, more Kinzhals, more guns, more tanks, more, right? More mobilization, more benefits to soldiers' families. And now he's calling for tighter lending. The spending that he's calling for has the exact same inflationary effect that he claims to be so worried about. This is like high school students could spot this contradiction. It's almost laughable if it wasn't so tragic.
The follow-up I'd ask is, I guess by extension, if their currency is, weakening in terms of Forex, and that, weakens their ability to import things, could we see potentially an impact on their ability to import some of the military articles, shells, UAVs, et cetera, that they've been trying to import from, say, Iran and potentially other third-party states?
Absolutely. And that's why you see there's a reason beyond the logistical why Russia is so eager to make deals with Iran and North Korea, because those are two countries where they can trade in kind. They don't really need to worry as much about currency valuations. When you're talking about India, where India is not going to take a trade in kind, India is a massive economy, and it's the largest country in the world by population. They're not going to be trading, bushels of wheat for S-300s. They're an advanced market economy. And that's why you saw so many of the Russian export deals fall apart there, just because the Indians were like, I want no part of your currency. And the Russians, incidentally, wanted no part of the Indian rupee. So yes, it does limit their ability, but when you're talking about a country like North Korea, where they will trade shells for grain, you have less of a foreign exchange risk. And you have Iran, where you already had such advanced bilateral security ties and so much dependency from Tehran on Moscow for, both not just actual hardware and defense equipment, but also know-how. And I don't think there was ever formal training, but certainly a knowledge exchange, especially around the nuclear development angle. So there's lots of ways that Russia can circumvent this if they're dealing with Venezuela, with Iran, with North Korea. But you're absolutely right. The weakest link in their military-industrial complex chain is importing advanced components, because you can only get those from advanced economies. And if your currency is weakening and weakening and weakening, those just become more and more and more expensive. And the more you import, the worse you make the problem.
I just one last follow-up, then I'll let you go to other questions. But given that China specifically is an advanced economy, what position will that put Russia in terms of importing, particularly replacement subcomponents for rather sophisticated systems, from fixed-wing aircraft to S-300, S-400, et cetera, where China may not necessarily have that same dynamic as North Korea or Iran, just because they're, a significantly advanced economy.
So with China and advanced components, you definitely will see it, and it has been seen at what I would call the sub-SOE level. So we're not talking about Chinese state-owned enterprises, and we're certainly not talking about the Chinese government or Chinese military itself, but smaller, nominally independent Chinese companies supplying dual-use equipment, put it that way, is definitely happening. The Chinese government's position to its own national companies has been very clear. Do not do anything that puts us even in the gray zone for sanctions. It's not that they're cowering before the almighty West. I'm not jingoistic when it comes to economics. There's no room for that. It's just pure pragmatism. It's not worth the squeeze. The gain of supplying Russia in a way that would clearly put them in sanctions jeopardy is the risk benefit doesn't make sense for them at all. But dual use components. Now, I don't know. I'm not a fixed wing aircraft expert. I don't know how many dual use microchips you can get from Chinese civilian electronic exports and actually use them in a fixed wing aircraft as a substitute. I know that it's possible to some degree because, people I've spoken to who work on these systems have said, we've seen this in downed aircraft or downed systems. These chips have been recovered. Certainly in the use of civilian drones, you're seeing that a lot. And certainly in things like, shawheads, which are essentially built in a garage or built to that level of sophistication, you're going to see that. But China, there was a meeting last fall where all the Chinese banks were called in to the government's offices in Beijing, and a senior party member essentially told them there will be no operations, there will be no business done that puts any of you, and certainly any of us, in sanctions jeopardy. It's not going to happen. And you immediately saw those banks follow suit and just cut off more business than they necessarily even had to. They were going to be as far away from crossing the line as they possibly could. And again, not for moral reasons. It's just pure pragmatism on China's part.
So you kind of mentioned drones there. We know that Russian volunteer groups, for instance, are purchasing parts from China and then putting together drones in Russia to send to the front line. Obviously, their buying power is going to decrease the more that this goes on. Is there a point at which it just won't be viable anymore? Or is there any other insight that we should be looking for into that particular transaction?
So it will get more and more expensive the weaker and weaker the currency gets. And since you're dealing with small Chinese companies rather than the Chinese state, there's no possibility of let's call it a strategic deal where Russia is getting a discounted price in exchange for considerations elsewhere. Leasing along the Amur River for, a special economic zone in Vladivostok you can't make that type of deal because you can only make that deal with the Chinese state, not a small Chinese company. So that's off the table. The price will go up and up and up. In terms of viability, the key question is one of will. How much pain is the Russian state willing to inflict on its own people in order to continue this conflict at a pace that they feel is necessary and a scope that they feel is necessary? History tells us that point is generally farther away than we think when it comes to the Russian state. They will go farther than most people imagine. Certainly, this government shows no real consideration for their own people and hasn't in the past, beyond a need for general political compliance. Now, there's an election coming up, and you've heard Soloviev talk about that. But I think when it comes to, funding, that kind of funding, I think they can find that money by selling assets here and there. Selling assets for cash. That's if this was a company, that's what a company would do. And Russia does have buyers for those assets, not just in Beijing, but elsewhere. But again, that would all go against Putin's kind of political playbook. Putin likes to be the benefactor. You saw that with the Russian Africa summit in St. Petersburg, right, where he was trying to hand out free grain. He wants to be the benefactor buying political favors. He doesn't want to be on the other side of that trade, but that's the position he's in. So it comes down to political will. They'll be able to find the cash to pay for it for quite some time. 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, depending on how far they're willing to go in economic repression and sales of assets.
Regarding,
I wish I had a happier answer. By the way, I wish I could say they've got 6 months left, but it's not what the numbers say.
Go ahead, Andrew.
No, you go ahead.
I actually had a question from the audience that somebody DM'd me. How do you think the interest rate increase will actually show effect on the population? Mortgage rates are typically fixed longer term in Russia. What can we expect?
So mortgage rates is obviously one of the first areas you look at when you have a rising interest rate environment. The country, not the country I'm in right now, but the country I live in, the UK, has a lot of not only just short-term mortgages, but it reprices the interest rate on a rolling basis. So rising rates in the UK were a much bigger deal than, say, they were in the US, where mortgages are priced at 15 to 30 years, at almost, I think it's 95% now, at fixed rate. There's 5% of the market is floating rate. In Russia, mortgages, first of all, for a lot of different constituencies are subsidized. So you also have that spending factor. And, if the subsidy goes up as the rate goes up, that would be kind of a net neutral to the consumers taking out mortgages. I think the bigger concern is in shorter term credit. So people who are trying to borrow money short term, whether it's credit cards, whether it is, small business loan, that's going to be the bigger concern of the rising rates. Given how many products are subsidized, and lack of effective price controls, I think the bigger concern is if rates don't get ahead of inflation. So if I were, to model the average Russian consumer and all of their potential economic pressure points, I think pricing would hit them harder than rising rates. It actually makes sense for them to raise rates if there's inflationary pressures. It doesn't make sense for them to raise rates necessarily in order to control the currency valuation.
Do you know the most current pricing changes? Because the last I looked, which was actually a long
7%.
time ago.
7% is reported.
Okay.
And we know it's higher than 7% because they're reporting 7% is the CPI. And we know that's doctored. And they actually got caught last year doctoring the CPI in public because the Central Bank of Russia released a price index that showed 11% year-on-year price rises on a basket of goods. And then Peskov came out and said, no, it was 4%. It wasn't 11%.
Yeah.
And the Central Bank of Russia came out and said, sorry, that was, someone forgot to carry the 2. It's actually 4%. So they got caught in real time doctoring the price index.
There's no way it's that low either. Because right. I know that the last I checked, which was a while ago, it was like 40% on average increase in prices.
So on some goods, you see that. I know this is unconfirmed. I saw the effective market price of bread was 140 rubles, for a loaf of bread, which would be over 40% year on year. I think that would be almost 100% year on year. But it's going to be different in different places, and in such a heavily subsidized economy, you're not going to have kind of the uniform pricing. You don't get it in any economy. Obviously, avocado is cheaper in California than it is in Germany, but it's even more. The discrepancies are even more exaggerated in an economy like Russia, where everyone's got a special deal.
Yeah, I've seen a bunch of like YouTube videos where they go to the same store and buy the exact same thing every few months, and they just compare the prices over time. I don't know if that's like a good way to do things, but it's just like a thing that they're doing, and they've been doing it. I've seen a lot of people doing this. It's not like one guy, but they're doing it like all around Russia in general. In like St. Petersburg, in Moscow, in like Vladivostok, and then some of the smaller towns in between. So it's not like one data point. It's not perfect, but it's like it's at least like it's a number of data points, and they all seem to be about from what they say, it's like 30 to 40%.
I would, if I had to guess, and there was a great study done by Jeffrey Sonnenfeld at Yale University. This was done this spring. I think it was either February or early March. And there was also the great article. I'm going to mispronounce his name, Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was arrested for that article and is still being held in Russia. Both of them, address, okay, we don't know. The official rate is BS, right? It's made up out of whole cloth. Both tried to take a stab at using these kind of methods, and the Yale study actually used a lot of the stuff you're talking about. These, individuals going out providing their own, same store, 3-month period price changes for the same store, same good, same location. I would bet it's, if I had to pick a number, broad market consumer price index inflation in Russia is probably around 25%. That's what I would think. But as you were saying, all of this is only mildly educated guessing. But it's certainly, whether it's 25 or 30 or 40, all of those numbers are scary high. And if it was 25 in March, right now it's probably trending 30, 35, because you have these massive inflationary pressures coming in, while you also had the central bank cutting rates. So it's whatever the exact number is, it's danger high. It's in that red area of the dial, and it is not getting any better.
There's a question here. I don't actually know if this question makes sense, so I'm just going to read it, and you can tell me if it makes sense or not. It says, what is the inflation rate in Russia when the ruble weakened from 49 to 1 USD in 2022 to 100 to 1 in August 2023? What kind of weakening should have quantified inflation?
Well, so again, the foreign exchange rate, the value of the ruble in terms of the US dollar and the purchasing power of the ruble within the Russian market are two different things. One has a big effect on the other and drives it. His dates and those numbers are not quite right. They're broadly right. Unless I misheard them, but so it's 101 in August 2022, and it did. I don't think it touched 49. Maybe it did. But it also, don't forget, touched 180 in early March of 2022. Short-term spikes are not going to have a huge effect. So that 180 I don't really count. When the ruble was strengthening, it was causing economic problems. It had deflationary problems. But at that time, Russia was also suffering high inflation for what economists would call endogenous reasons. So yes, a weakening currency will drive higher inflation, but it's not the only driver of inflation. It's not even the primary driver. So it's not a direct correlation. But to answer the exact question, literally, the inflation rate reported when the ruble was at 49, they were reporting an inflation. That was around the time that Nabolina reported. This is like April 2022. Nabolina reported 11%, and Peskov said, "No, you mean 4%." She's like, "Oh, sorry, I meant 4%." And now they're saying it's 7%. But again, we all can make up numbers.
Yeah. So, a moment ago, you were talking about the less developed, trading with less developed countries is good if you have a weaker currency. And we had a question regarding that. And I can't remember the exact question, but it was more or less, is that why Russia is trying to move towards Africa right now?
So when I was saying, if you have a weak currency trading with like Iran or Venezuela or North Korea, it wasn't because they were necessarily less developed. Certainly, there's countries that are less developed economically than Iran that would not fall into the category where they're going to make an in-kind or a strategic economic deal where you're getting an economic discount for strategic considerations elsewhere. The reason I chose those three countries is because not just of their economy, but also their political basket cases, with very corrupt governments who are more than willing to make, a deal that's very economically advantageous for Russia on one side because of strategic or other considerations, including personal kickbacks, stuff like that. Or Russian military advisors coming in for free, and thus, might be more willing to engage in a way that compensates for Russia's foreign exchange difficulties. And also, these are countries, by the way, whose currencies are also in the toilet. The North Koreans effectively don't really have a currency; it's never been traded. Venezuela's currency is in the toilet. Iran's currency, less so, certainly less so than Venezuela, but it's still not an ideal situation. With Africa, that is a strategic play. That is not one driven by economic necessity, but by political necessity. That is, it was not necessarily. You could debate how much it was planned. Russia's growing influence in Africa, or the regrowth of Russian influence. Obviously, the Soviet Union had a ton of influence in Africa, especially during the 1980s with the wars of liberation in Southern Africa, especially, as well as in Ethiopia. Those were effectively client states of the Soviet Union, like Angola, lesser degree Mozambique, but certainly Ethiopia and Angola. So it's always been a political play rather than economic play for them. And that's why, again, the Russian African summit that they held in Petersburg this year. Incidentally, fun fact, when it was held in 2019, 43 African leaders attended. When it was held this year, only 19 African leaders attended. So it's important not to overstate Russia's influence in Africa. It's certainly around the Sahel, Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, and now Niger. Obviously, there's ties to South Africa. Don't get me started on the BRICS. But it's always been driven. Central African Republic is actually, you could call a Wagnerite vassal state at this point. But it's always been driven by political ambition rather than economics. And that's why you saw Putin was essentially offered 10 Russian states free grain, giving away grain while he has his own economic problems.
Very bold.
But can we just put a little bit of context around that? He offered them one ship full of grain each,
yes,
and not a big ship, like a medium-sized ship. And when you put that all into perspective, it's not very much. And when you look at their funding for the World Food Program this year, it's pathetic, to say the least. So,
like everything Putin does with his largesse, it was mostly a sham. A gift from Putin is usually not a gift at all. It reminded me a lot of, remember the whole thing about Europe will pay rubles for gas and oil, which was never even Russia's intention. They could care less because they were already converting the currency. It would have zero economic impact which currency they used. It's okay, so you pay in rubles. Okay, I'll buy rubles, then you'll get the rubles, sell them for the foreign exchange you want anyway. It was all about getting Europeans to work with Gazprom Bank and other sanctioned institutions. In the same way, this was Putin grandstanding, trying to look like the benefactor to Africa. the great power he wishes Russia was. But again, it's with Russia and Africa, it's been political. There's economic little pockets of opportunity that open up here and there, but small scale.
So a different question is first. Okay, this is kind of like a two-part question. First part is, how's the real estate in Russia? How's that going? And second, is it even relevant?
I do not have an informed answer to the first part, which I think probably gives away my answer to the second part.
Okay.
I don't even know how reliable, because real estate deals in Russia are about as it makes the art market look transparent and rule abiding. It's so opaque and inherently corrupt. I've read enough anecdotal evidence of people from outside Russia operating in Russia, especially in the early 2000s or really pre 2014, and even at that point, it was the trying to find actual market data on prices for comparative values was almost impossible. A deal was never straightforward. I don't really think, given how much housing is subsidized by the state, for the average person, and given the legacy of mixed at best legacy of Soviet house building or Soviet residential planning, I don't think that it is really going to be a key indicator. But if there's someone who is a real expert on the Russian real estate market, they will definitely have more color on that than I do.
Gotcha. I just remember hearing absurd numbers about vacant homes in Russia, and the
they have a
numbers are just
declining
funny.
population.
Yeah. It was like, I think he said that it was like 1 billion square feet, which is like a lot of square feet.
So the one thing about Russia and real estate that I would really have an opinion on would be the real estate that's being purchased outside of Russia. And as a resident of London, I can tell you that it's been fantastic for people looking to buy cheaper houses. If you were to look at the index, obviously they were only buying mansions. So unless you were in the market for a mansion, it's not really going to affect the London housing market. But no, they're all the favorite way to store stolen or ill-gotten gains by the average Russian apparatchik was to buy an apartment in Dubai. That's like the classic move. Formerly Cyprus, less so now.
Yeah, there's a lot of pro-war Russians in Dubai right now. I've seen videos of people just walking around Dubai, just like ambient noise type videos, just to get the vibe of the place. There's a whole lot of Z people. I'll just put it that way. A lot of Z people.
A lot of people who have found a compelling reason not to serve at the front for the war that they so fervently support.
Exactly. Yeah. Anyways, John, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, I did have one. What relationship does the official forex exchange rate with regard to the ruble have to the black market exchange rate, and is the discrepancy, whatever it is between them, is that of broader significance?
So it's a good point, and the answer to the first part of your question is it depends for whom. The discrepancy, if you are a Mobik who is on leave back in Moscow and you want to buy some dollars, you will not be getting anything close to the official exchange rate. It's not. I'm going to oversimplify this here. It's not like lined up against a wall and shot illegal to buy dollars. It's not anywhere near that. It's not restricted to the degree that it was during much of the Soviet Union for the average citizen to buy dollars. You will not be getting that official exchange rate or anywhere near that if you're just the average guy walking down the street trying to turn some rubles into some dollars. If you are a Chinese chemical plant buying fertilizer or natural gas from Russia, you're probably going to be getting something pretty close to that exchange rate. So the black market is more evident in what we would call retail transactions than institutional transactions. One of the big questions is how much does the Russian state clamp down on those private, retail foreign exchange transactions? Because they could simply say it's illegal, and if you get caught, it's 20 years in prison or you go to the front. And they would have the power to enforce that. And that's one of those weapons in the arsenal of financial repression. And if that does happen, then you will see a real, like, Soviet-style black market open up, where there's like a listed, black market exchange rate, and you can compare it directly.
So is there currently a legal mechanism then for, I guess, private individuals in Russia to exchange their rubles for dollars? Or is there a reason to go to the black market? Is what I'm asking, I guess.
There is yes, the one word answer is yes, there's a legal mechanism. There are severe limitations on it about how much you can convert, when. So you can convert X today, and then maybe you can convert that same amount again 3 months from now. The last time I did the slog of reading through Russian legislation using Google Translate, I can speak like 200 words of Russian, and it's useless when trying to read a bill. The last time I did that was when they passed the currency and foreign exchange law. I want to say it's early April. Yeah, it was the first week of April 2022. That was the big crackdown they did. And that just imposed a bunch of capital controls. And like I said, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but you can convert a small amount on the first of the month and then no more until 30 days later, kind of thing. And doing so conspicuously or doing so through loopholes was likely to draw the attention of the authorities, and maybe you were going to get a tax audit. They're less concerned about the individuals than they are about the companies, and small companies doing so, and companies doing it as a front for individuals trying to move money out of Russia.
Gotcha. And then, so I guess to my original question, the second part, what does this discrepancy mean? I guess if it isn't a major factor at the institutional level, what is going to be the impact on the average Russian?
Well, if you have a real thriving black market, the first consequence is the state loses its ability to properly regulate its own economy. Because you can then impose all that arsenal of financial repression only applies to the legal market. And so you have to be careful how many of those tools you use. And there are countries that use them very effectively. China has, incredibly strict capital controls in place. China essentially has two currencies, an onshore one and an offshore one. And so China's had that, and it's been sustainable, and it works, and people have gotten used to it, and there's not a huge black market in dollars. There's tons of corruption, but there's not a huge black market like meeting a guy in an alley and secretly swapping some won for some dollars, the way that there was in the Soviet Union, or there still is in Cuba. So that's the biggest consequence, is if you get that growth of the informal economy, or the black market, whatever you want to call it, it really does undermine the ability of the state to regulate its own economy. For the average Russian, it also just, the average Russian is used to financial repression and repression in general. So I don't think it's going to cause people to take to the streets. I think you would see that if you had out of control inflation. Was it the late 80s when the Soviet Union put, was it the tax on sugar that led to a spike in vodka prices, or they removed the subsidy or the state monopoly on vodka? I'm forgetting the exact details, and it was one of the few times you saw large-scale protests in the Soviet Union because the price of sugar and the price of vodka skyrocketed. And people were like, I'm sorry, I'm just not putting up with this anymore. And the government quickly backed down. So I think inflation is what makes, when people can't afford bread, that's when they go out in the streets.
Okay. I've heard some interesting stories about that dollar black market, but I don't know enough to get into it. I just remember like last year, I heard it was like the ruble was like set to 70, I think, at the time, but to buy a dollar on the black market was like 140, and it was just absurd.
Yeah. So I remember that story when it came out, and that's more of an effective rate than a true black market. So when you land at an airport, there are those little kiosks where you can exchange your currency. And if you actually look at the rate they're giving you, it's wildly different than what like the FX rate that day is. If you're converting dollars to euros, right? They're just saying, well, that's the commission. So that was more what you were seeing than people, Cuban style, actually like, I'll hand you a wallet full of I don't know what the Cuban currency is off the top of my head, but I'll hand you a wallet full of the Cuban currency. You hand me a wallet or an envelope full of US dollars at some extortionate rate. That kind of subterfuge is not, it is present. It certainly is, but it's taking place more in fudging numbers on balance sheets between, my little company that I have in Rostov and your shipping company that you have in Vladivostok. And the net effect is actually I managed to get some dollars. But you rake me over the coals on the rate.
Yeah. And if I remember right, that black market, it gradually, I don't even know if it was gradually, it was like it pretty quickly went down. And I remember I heard it was like 140 and then like 100 and then like 75 and then I think at one point it was actually lower than the reported rate.
One of the reasons for that was there was a lack of demand for dollars at the time. And that was the initial reaction to the other capital controls brought in, because they said, well, you can't take currency out of the country. So you can have dollars, but where are you going to send them? You could hide them under your mattress if they're physical dollars. If you held a dollar bank account in Russia, which is, by the way, this is something that I think is underreported. Almost every country in the world has banks that have dollar-based bank accounts in them. Not North Korea, obviously. Presumably, actually, maybe Iran probably does. No, Iran definitely does. That's why you keep paying Iran billions of dollars for their dollar-based bank accounts. So there are people who have dollar-based bank accounts within Russia, dollar-denominated bank accounts. But those accounts, they say, well, you can't take that money out of the country. Or they might say, you are hereby requested with air quotes, convert this into a ruble-based bank account. So the demand for dollars went down a lot, because unless you're taping them around your chest under a heavy sweater and trying to cross the border, you really couldn't get them out of the country.
Yep. Well, I don't have any more questions. Exit, do you have any more questions?
I'm not sure that I do. I was mulling all of that over and I hadn't come up with anything yet.
Okay. John, do you have any more questions? Okay. And, Francis, do you have any questions? Okay, I think we're out of questions.
Andrew,
sounds good.
I was going to say I got one if no one else
CJ,
does.
you go.
Yeah, so sort of financially related, I've been doing a lot of research into sort of production rates in Russia, specifically artillery, and I keep finding in the last decade and a half so many different Russian production plants going bankrupt but still producing things. I guess, could you sort of explain what it means specifically, at least in terms of Russia, like what going bankrupt means, and if it really has any effect in terms of what kind of capital they can acquire and sort of how it actually affects production?
Going bankrupt, a corporation going bankrupt in Russia is part of a financial political stage play to follow certain letters of Russian law while completely violating their spirit as an exercise in outright corruption. And nowhere is that more present than in their military-industrial complex, which is essentially at the top run by Siloviki, people who knew Putin and Patrushev and others in Petersburg in the early 90s. And, there's a lot of good books you can read just about what it's like running a company in Russia. Bill Browder's book, Red Notice, comes to mind with the different tax bills that he was given from companies that were, in some stage of insolvency, because essentially he'd paid the company he was supposed to pay. The money then disappeared. He said, "Oh, we're bankrupt. You still owe us this money." And it's, all done through not the Kazan People's, but it was the Tuvan People's Republic or Tuvan Autonomous Court, which was completely compromised and bought off by the FSB. It's all political theater, and it's all just an exercise in corruption. The use of bankruptcy laws. It's an odd instance that there's this fidelity to the letter of the law. It's like, why don't you just sign a paper saying the money's mine now? But there's this tendency, we have to go through the motions, even if everyone knows that it's a rigged process.
What do these bankruptcies mean in the context of either state-owned, in the context of state-owned, either in a whole or in part, corporations and entities?
So I'll give you go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was going to say, I think I can think of at least a couple examples, I think, where either a partially or wholly state-owned defense company has gone bankrupt, like I think the producer of Tornado S and a couple others.
So this is a hypothetical example. Company A produces military equipment parts. It has 2 plants, and it has warehouses full of production inputs. And it is run by a former FSB colonel. He sells both of the plants to paper companies owned by his brother and his father-in-law for 20% of their value. The purchases are funded by a loan that is guaranteed by that FSB retired colonel personally. And the stock is then sold to other paper companies controlled by the guy who used to sit next to him in Moscow at the next desk. And then that is all reconstituted into Newco, free of all of its debt that it had taken on to buy the plant and to buy all of the production inputs. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. Oh, now we're bankrupt. Sorry, we can't pay back those debts. If you did that in the United States, that would be called fraudulent conveyance. You sold something to escape debts and actually had a beneficial ownership in it. If anyone watched Tiger King, that Netflix documentary, when he's getting sued and he sells off all of his trucks and his park to his mom for $1, that's fraudulent conveyance, and that's one of the many reasons he went to jail. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And this is all, gets a wink and a nod from courts and from the regulators, who, of course, are all getting their cut.
Does this type of systemic corruption, dysfunction, graft, etc. You were speaking to more or less Russia selling its sovereignty to other third-party states or entities controlled by third-party states, particularly the Chinese. What for a Chinese company attempting to enter this environment? What is the implication of all these dynamics for them?
So let's say that I am, secretary of the Standing Committee of the Communist Party of China, deputized to secure these purchases. I'm not going to take Gazprom stock. Or I might take Gazprom stock because it's Gazprom, and also I'm China. But take it maybe a few levels down from Gazprom. I'm not going to take the stock. I'm going to take the assets. And so these assets will now be owned by Sinopec or PetroChina. And the assets are what matters, and I'll just give you the cash. So both Gazprom and Rosneft are the product of dozens of post-Soviet companies that all came into being and grew in the fashion I just described. So Yukos, Gazprom, the former Yukos. The Yukos deal is detailed, which Putin presided over, by the way, was daylight robbery. The Yukos owner was essentially told, you're going to sell for 20% of its value, and you're going to sell to this person who's loyal to Putin. You'll do it now, who was a politician at the time, the owner. He was like in the cabinet. You'll do it now, or there will be a tax investigation opened against you. This is what happened to Khodorkovsky. And so they essentially got played at their own game. This is how the oligarchs became rich. And then Putin oligarched the oligarchs using the exact same techniques these guys had used to rob post-Soviet Russia of its natural resources. And it's all the private investors who bought shares. And so when you're talking about China coming into this environment, China is in the unique position where it would have leverage over Putin himself. And so they might be more willing. But I think that if it wasn't Gazprom, it would, where they might take stock, I think that it would be to sell us the assets or grant us the economic privileges. The Amur River, which is the river that flows along most of Russia and China's land border, is a good example. You have, on the Russian side of that border, you have Chinese merchants dotting almost the entire length of populated regions. You could grant those merchants special economic status, which means there's no import duties. You could do the same in Vladivostok. And so that's the kind of mortgaging of sovereignty that China would be demanding, rather than willing to just take shares, given that they know full well what happens to minority shareholders in Russia.
All right. We have some like really sarcastic remarks about various Russian CEOs and stuff, but we'll stay out of that. I do have one question regarding access to things like turbines, especially for power plants, but also for airplanes. And we also had another question about the civilian what's the word? Aviation industry, the civilian aviation industry. So those are two kind of turbine related questions for you.
So when it comes to very specific components, I know enough to know that I'm not an expert. Serdushka, who I think has been on your show before, he has done so much work on any number of very specific components, including turbines. He can speak for an hour just on ball bearings. And the different supply bottlenecks that Russia faces and where they can get the right parts from, the restrictions on their ability to manufacture these components domestically at greater scale. I'm not an expert on turbines by any means, or at least this is on turbines for airframes. In terms of gas turbines, we saw that whole farrago with Canada that Russia was using as an excuse. Well, we can't get our repaired turbine back because of sanctions for Nord Stream, therefore we're just going to shut down Nord Stream 1 in perpetuity. That was right before it was blown up. So it's, a lot of the turbine infrastructure is incredibly sophisticated and these are not turbines from 1970 where you just need physical parts. These are electronic industrial devices that you need the software updates for them, for the programs that actually manage the turbines and operate them. So a lot of that is going to be very, very hard. We saw how hard it was for Iran to operate its centrifuges and Natanz without the software updates. That was what gave the US the back door for Stuxnet. So advanced mass industrial electronic components are going to be very, very, very tough. Turbines for airframes and for civilian aviation. You can look for civilian aviation, you look to Iran and all their planes that dropped out of the sky after so many years of sanctions. Russia definitely has greater capacity for domestic manufacturing of civilian aviation components than Iran did, but it's still going to be pretty limited. It's hard to scale that up and meet your previous level of civilian aviation activity in a short period of time. But again, I'm not expert enough in specific components to give you like a hard and fast answer.
Is there a civilian aviation industry like alive, or is it is it coasting or?
I don't remember the name of the company. I remember so the Aeroflot's the carrier, but the company that manufactures the planes.
Sukhoi Superjets. That's their only really domestic civilian airliner.
So I don't think it might be them. I don't have enough expertise to say for sure on this. I just do know that at one of the Moscow expos, they did debut a little paper mache model of what they said was going to be their replacement civilian airliner. And I might not be an expert. I do know enough to know that that's a ridiculous thing to say when all you have is a paper mache model of an airplane.
Yeah, I think they said they were going to make like 23 a year or something, and they made like one.
Yeah, it's going to be the next Tu-14 Armada. It's going to be great. I put it this way: I doubt anyone in the upper echelons of the Russian government is going to put their kids on one of those planes anytime soon.
And the fuel efficiency, oy.
That was never, in the Soviet era, that they never really concerned themselves with that. They were always quite gluttonous in terms of fuel efficiency, and I guess that's their military industrial or civilian industrial, in this case, doctrine, the legacy of Soviet doctrine.
Okay. Yeah. I don't have any more economic questions. I have a question for John, though. It's regarding missiles and the large number that were fired last night. I don't know if do you want to talk about that for a moment?
If you can buy me 2 minutes to move to someplace with less background noise, yes.
Okay. Because last night, I can't even remember all the cities that got hit. There was Lviv, Lutsk, Dnipro. What else? There was more. I can't remember them all. Oh, Ivano-Frankivsk. Were there more? I can't remember. But all these places got hit by missiles. Lviv got hit by 2 missiles that I know the locations of. One landed in like this little kindergarten, and the other landed in a pretty much adjacent apartment building. I don't know. Supposedly they're both shot down, and I don't know if those would be the falling fragments from the missiles that were shot down, or the falling fragments of the interceptors. But either way, it made rather large explosions, or perhaps even just interceptors. Period. I don't know. I don't know what exactly what happened, and roughly the same thing happened in the other cities. Supposedly all the missiles were shot down. I don't actually know if that's true. That was a question I had for John. I don't know if I've bought enough time.
Yes, you have. Sorry, there's people in my house talking very loudly on their cell phones. So regarding the raid last night, in total, I believe it was reported that Ukraine shot down 16 of 28 launched KH-101s. One thing I would like to say is they put up a very large number of Tu-95s last night. And every single time that happens, everybody on social media gets very angsty. Oh, there's going to be 40, there's going to be 50, there's going to be 60 cruise missiles. It never is. It's always 30. I just wish people would not fixate on the number of aircraft so much, because it never amounts to anything, because they can only produce about 70 a month. And these missiles are coming essentially directly off the production line as is. But that's a sidebar. As for the damage last night, My understanding of what happened is incomplete. The main damage that I saw was obviously in Lviv, where a number of residential buildings were struck. My understanding is that most of the impacts are located fairly close to one of the airports in Lviv. Obviously, there was damage in Lutsk. I'm less clear on where exactly geographically that was located. But broadly speaking, my understanding from last night is that the primary targets seem to be a number of airfields in Western Ukraine. This would fit into the overall trend that we've seen with Russian raids over the past month and a half, 2 months. They have, since the arrival of Storm Shadow and Scalp EG, most of their raids have been focused on attempting to neutralize specifically Staro-Konstantinivka, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, or Staro-Konstantinivka, I think, the air base in kind of central to Western Ukraine. That is the peacetime primary airfield of the 7th Tactical Aviation Brigade, which operates Ukraine's fleet of Su-24Ms and MRs that have now been adapted to serve as launch platforms for Storm Shadow / Scalp EG. The Russians mounted a number of very sizable raids featuring cruise missiles, Shaheds, and ballistic missiles, Kinzhal specifically, against the airfield on multiple occasions. Thus far, they have very clearly failed to put the 7th Tactical Aviation Brigade and its Su-24Ms out of action. After all of these raids, they were always followed up by Ukrainian Storm Shadow strikes on various different targets. It was always, I guess, implicitly obvious that the Su-24Ms were not concentrated at that airbase. They were always dispersed, as are most of the fixed-wing assets of the Ukrainian Air Force since essentially day one of the war, or day one of the invasion, I should say. So my guess, and this is the conjecture on my part, would be that the Russians were attempting to strike what they believe to be secondary airfields for the Su-24Ms. That would be my gut instinct.
Yeah, this image here was the result of a missile in Ivano-Frankivsk. You can tell that this is not an airport. It's actually a small farmhouse. A very high value target, as you can see. Yeah, so yesterday, if I remember, there was a strike. I'm going to try to find it on my map yesterday. Do you know if this was like a Storm Shadow strike? I assume it was. It was in Urivka, near like Mariupol. Do you know if that was a Storm Shadow? I don't know what it would be other than a Storm Shadow, honestly. Supposedly it hit a repair station and a barracks of some sort. Do you know about that?
So, I mean, if it was in Mariupol, then it was probably Storm Shadow. The only other asset they have at their disposal that has sufficient range is Vil'Shana potentially, and maybe some of their one-way attack UAVs, but that's about it. So, I mean, it was probably Storm Shadow, just probabilistically.
Yeah, that's what I assumed. There were also unconfirmed reports that there were a lot of casualties in that building. I'm actually curious to see a high-res image of that area, because I'm not entirely convinced this happened. It was just we saw explosions. Like, there are like images of things that were like on fire and stuff. So I just don't know. When they tell me like there were 40 Russians died, like I don't know if that's true, but I don't know. Anyway, moving on. There are also some strikes deeper back. I think one was in Melitopol, and another was in Skadovsk. And also today, we got those videos of the S-300s being destroyed. Now, I don't know if we figured out exactly what time that happened. If I remember right, Gick looked through and he I'm just gonna say it. He 100% found out that it happened on July 23rd. And if you asked him, he's totally confident in that. I'm not being sarcastic at all. But anyways, it probably happened towards the end of July, but not in August. So maybe like the 3rd or 4th week of July. So it is a reasonably new video, and it is interesting seeing 3 S-300 explode, and 2 radars get damaged, and a fuel truck, I think, too.
So we haven't seen, that much video of the S-300Vs. They have them. They definitely have them. A fairly substantial number of them, in my understanding. Although my grasp of the exact quantitative figures is not the best, just due to a lack of information, a lack of my time, and a lack of time on my part to really dig into it. But I think all of the S-300V losses that we've seen, and almost all of the footage of Russian S-300Vs in general, has been from Kherson. We saw them previously. Their most notable deployment was on the immediate left bank of the Dnipro prior to the liberation of the right bank. Those were obviously displaced and redeployed further to the rear following the liberation of Kherson, of Kherson City, and the rest of the right bank. So S-300V it's very different than S-300P. The distinction is that the P at the end of S-300P denotes air defense troops, or the air defense forces of the then Soviet air defense forces. They were their own independent branch of service. The V at S-300V indicates ground forces, and that's operated by the air defense troops of the Russian ground forces. In terms of optimization capabilities, S-300P and its successor S-400, which is just a rebranded S-300P, is really optimized for aerodynamic threats. Originally, it was cruise missiles, specifically U.S. nuclear-armed cruise missiles. S-300V, on the other hand, is more so optimized for ballistic targets, so tactical ballistic missiles. It's also, like Buk, mounted on tracked chassis and features TLARs, transporter erector launcher, and radar. So you have a fire control radar functionality included on a number of the TELs, unlike S-300P. That's part of the overall effort to increase the cross-country mobility and compactness of the system, like Buk, to enable it to more easily kind of keep pace with mobile ground forces.
So I don't know if you see what I'm showing right now, but is this that radar you were talking about? Because we have a launcher here that has 3 missiles and a little tower sticking up. Is that the radar?
Sorry. Issues. Yes, that's 300V. That's the TLR. The one with the 3 tubes, the 3 TPKs, as they're called in Russian. Those are 9M83s or 9M83Ms. And then the one with the 2 large tubes, those are either 9M82s or 9M82Ms.
Okay. Yeah, those other ones they're a lot bigger. they're a lot bigger missiles, aren't they?
Substantially. Their overall design is quite similar, but the 9M82 has a rather substantially well, its diameter is significantly larger and has a very large booster at the bottom of it. It's the long range interceptor of the system. 9M83 ranges out to about 80 kilometers. 9M82 is substantially longer range than that.
Are you talking like 300 kilometers or what?
Give me a minute to check what the published number is, because I don't remember off the top of my head.
Okay.
I think it's 100 plus kilometers. It might not actually be that much more now that I think about it. I might be getting mixed up with the very large improvement they claimed with the upgrades, the M series for both of them.
Okay. So
yeah, I think it's about 100, 110, 20 kilometers. Yeah.
Okay. Is that the like the ideal range? Like, because like they say like ranges that it's like a lot of the max ranges is only if like the plane is flying directly at you, right? So is that like the ideal
it's
max range? Or?
So the ranges, those. So there's really let's just talk about aerodynamic targets because that's easier for the moment. So the quoted range figures, those are going to be a function of the target's altitude, as well as its radar cross section, as well as its maneuverability. So you might see for 48N6DM, which is the latest version of the 48N6 interceptor, which is the most common S300. Well, it's the most common interceptor used by S300, Russian S300Ps and S400s. That has a published range of 250 kilometers. It only has that range of 250 kilometers against targets at high altitude. And typically speaking, it only has a decent probability of kill if that target is fairly large and non-maneuverable. And then once you start looking at radar cross-section, then you also kind of get, well, kind of independently of that, you can only engage at, whatever the maximum range that your sensor can detect the target at. So in reality, the practical engagement range for a fighter-sized object at medium to low altitude is going to be substantially smaller.
Gotcha. All right. So,
and then for ballistic, it's not even worth discussing S300P and S400, to be quite honest.
Okay. All right. But anyways, I interrupted you talking about the missiles because I found that the image with the little radar thing sticking out, and I wanted to point it out.
Oh yes, about the raid. That is what I was talking about, right? I totally lost my train of thought.
Sorry. Yeah.
No worries. So, beyond Lutsk, obviously that striking Ivano-Frankivsk, and then Lviv, I believe I could be totally wrong about this because I have not done my due diligence to verify the authenticity of this footage. I think there were a series of strikes on the Pivdenmash plant in Dnipro, Pivdenmash being historically one of Ukraine's largest missile manufacturers. They produced, everything up from during the Soviet Union. They produced ICBMs, as well as space launch vehicles. Post dissolution, they mainly produced space launch vehicles. The booster, the first stage for Antares, and then Cyclone, and a couple of others, and then various other sort of rocketry stuff. They're also, in theory, the primary manufacturers, or they're supposed to be, of Ukraine's two, standoff munition systems, SAPSM, their short-range ballistic missile system, and Korshun, which are their conceptual ground-launched cruise missile program. In terms of production, Pivdenmash, at least historically, prior to the invasion, was responsible for both of those. KB Pivdini, which is historically associated with it, was responsible for the design of those systems. The Russians have carried out raids against the Pivdenmash plant multiple times. the level of damage is obviously a total unknown. Ukrainian war production is obviously a state secret. None of that, battle damage assessment would never be disclosed for obvious reasons. It's pretty widely understood at this point that Ukrainian defense production is fairly widely dispersed across a wide range of sites and facilities. A number of the pre-existing manufacturing plants had underground production halls. To what extent, I don't know. I just have images of a couple of them. I have images from either the Vizar or the Artem plant in Kyiv. I've been able to identify which one conclusively, but at least some of them do have underground production halls. There's mine shafts, there's underground tunnel complexes everywhere. They have it, their production facilities, squirreled away, being God knows where, all across the country. So it's really not possible to say, what the larger impact of this would be. I mean, especially given that they've already struck the plant multiple times, and at least nothing's, public has come of it.
There was a bizarre thing that I read today. I think it was Rybar or somebody. I'm not really sure. But they claimed that Ukraine was using a granary to manufacture drones, like the naval drones. And I can't even imagine, like, believing something that stupid. Why would you use a granary to manufacture drones?
I mean, in principle, they can set up production in any kind of building. I mean, they could literally go and set up in a shed if they wanted to. I mean, I know there's local production efforts that are literally set up in sheds.
But like, I mean, like, I know it would be possible to do it, but like, why would Ukraine manufacture drones in a granary? Like, the granaries are already threatened by Russia. It would not be a good place to hide. But whatever. I think it's just justification to shoot granaries, honestly.
I mean, it's Rybar. What do you expect?
Yeah. I can't remember if it was actually Rybar, but it was one of the Russian people. And I can't. I don't know if they were referring to the Shahed attack tonight in Odessa. And I don't know if that attack even attacked a granary, although I wouldn't be surprised considering those comments about producing drones in granaries in Odessa. So, I don't know. It's just, it strikes me like Rybar, like last year, he wrote an article about how a school in Kryvyi Rih was being used by like generals or something, and then the next morning they shot a missile into the school and killed a bunch of teachers and stuff. So it's just that sort of thing is just kind of par for the course for Rybar at this point. It's like he gets news of what Russia is going to shoot next and then invents a story to justify it. But anyways, I don't know. Do you want to comment on the S300 that Ukraine lost? Because there have been a lot of rumors about that video being old. And I am not going to say it's not old, because I honestly don't know when that video happened. But I do know that I never saw it prior to yesterday. And everyone I talked to hadn't seen it, although that doesn't mean much necessarily. But did you hear anything about that?
I haven't seen anything specific. I mean, unfortunately, the broader trend of Ukrainian S-300P losses is to be expected. The systems that Ukraine possesses are, unfortunately, they really, really suffer badly from the short range of the 5V55R interceptors, which were the second generation interceptor introduced for S-300P. 4.8N6 being the third generation. That's what the Russians primarily use. The range of 5V55R is not good. It's 80 kilometers. So what that means as a practical matter is that they want to project an anti-access area denial bubble with these assets behind the Russian forward line of troops, say 40 kilometers. That means they have to get their S-300Ps within 40 kilometers of the front line. That is very dangerous, especially given that S-300P, being an air defense system, is an emitter. It emits radio frequency emissions that can be detected with radio direction finding and other means, obviously anti-radiation missiles and those other tricks. So these systems are fundamentally vulnerable because of just the limited size of their weapon engagement, of their engagement envelopes, to be precise.
And if there is ever a range you don't want to be, it's 40 kilometers, because that's a Lancet.
Yes, exactly. And what we've seen is that a lot of these losses have kind of been in the Kherson-Mykolaiv area. We've seen others in Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, etc., but most of them have really kind of been in Kherson and Mykolaiv. Mostly 2 Lancets. In some cases, I think we've seen guided bombs or MRLs. But please forgive my camera.
Okay.
But yeah, in most cases, that's been the Lancets. So in addition to obviously the fundamental vulnerability that comes from such a limited engagement envelope, Ukrainian air defense capabilities broadly suffer from the fact that they do have an integrated air and missile defense system. They do. It's not well integrated though, and it's not well layered. It's very, very uneven and inconsistent, and they don't have a good mix of lower tier and higher tier assets. So they really, really have a shortage of the lower tier assets that they would need to really protect S-300P, which is the higher tier asset for them, in the way that you would want to. In theory, I think they're supposed to have towed AAA or towed anti-aircraft guns attached to them. I can't remember, I think with each S-300P battery. In practice, they usually don't. So they just don't physically have the counter UAS and the SHORAD systems that need to be attached to these higher tier ground-based air defense assets in order to protect them in the way that you would want to. And that really exacerbates the issues that they have with that engagement, with that limited engagement envelope.
So what ideally would defend them?
Ideally, you would want things like, you would want an IRIS tier and NASAMS. You would want one basically, you would only want to have your S-300Ps deployed within the engagement envelope, or the weapon engagement zone, in this case, of a NASAM, of an IRIS-T SLM, of a Gepard. You would want mobile anti-aircraft guns attached to literally every single S-300P battalion. You would want them to be again in the engagement envelope, operating within the engagement envelopes, weapon engagement zones, whatever, of other surface air missile systems. You need to have that layering that they just don't have enough systems to provide.
What's the name of the new German thing? I can't remember what it's called. Skynex. Are those available? I can't remember.
One of them, one system. Yeah,
that's not enough.
Europe does not have enough ground-based air defense, neither does the United States. It's really an area that we've underinvested in for decades for a lot of reasons, and even in those areas where we did make a decent investment, it was not across this complete spectrum of capabilities. So, while, for example, the U.S. Army underinvested in ground-based air defense capabilities as a whole, the one area where we did put a lot of money is Patriot. We have 60 Patriot batteries across 15 battalions at any given time. One of those is a test battalion, so 4 batteries that are just for testing and validation training. Another four batteries that are in any given time in an upgrade process. So typically we have around 50 to 52 operational batteries at any given time. and then that's it. We have nothing else. We have stingers. It's literally just stingers and Patriot historically. We have like we have, stingers on mobile platforms. We had Avenger. We obviously had the linebacker, but we basically went from man pads to a strategic SAM with nothing in between.
Yeah.
We didn't have medium range or short range system.
It really is weird
We
when
are
you think about
trying-
it.
We're trying to correct that now. We're introducing MSHORAD, we're introducing MLIDs, and a whole bunch of variety of counter UAS stuff. We are looking at IFPC, interim fire protection capabilities, which is sort of a fixed slash semi-fixed medium range capability. So we are kind of moving in that area. But right now, we don't really have anything we can give besides man pads and besides Patriot.
So here's
And Europe
some
is not in a great state either.
here's some weird questions. We're gonna get weird for a second. First, do we have any like obsolete airplanes that could do this?
So, well, that's the European F-16s in a nutshell.
Okay. Well, no.
That's
do we
that's
have?
what they're going to be. So that's what they're going to be doing half the time if we give them.
Yeah. Do we have like? I don't think the West even developed these, but do we have like air-to-air helicopters?
Apache Longbow
Well,
with
something.
the Longbow Hellfire.
Something that is
I think,
something that could be
No.
given.
well,
We don't have anything like lesser, like a
yes, we do. We
Like a Black Hawk.
APKWS. We if we can, yeah. So there is a weapons package for Black Hawk, including like a bunch of targeting sensors, like electro-optical observation, like sensor pod with a laser designator, infrared, for imager, etc. I think we can put APKWS. Please forgive my cat. On there, and that can be used like against Shaheads and stuff like that. Potentially.
Yeah.
We can also put on next one.
Yeah, and then there's other stuff like Avengers and Ocelots and stuff like that, which Ukraine will never get in enough numbers. So, and I don't even know if this would be. I guess with an Ocelot, this could be like a good use case, maybe. Avengers should probably be closer to the front, I imagine.
The fundamental issue with Stinger, which includes obviously the man pads themselves as well as Avenger, which uses the Stinger interceptor,
And the Ocelot.
is that our defense industrial base in terms of capacity is not in a good spot with Stinger. We needed to replace it a long time ago, and we didn't. And we basically just kept an obsolescent man pads and interceptor in service for much longer than we should have. And as a result, we can't produce them anymore because the legacy subcomponents that are required to manufacture it are no longer feasibly procurable. So we have to redesign. We're trying to restart production of it, but in order to restart production, we literally have to redesign the whole thing because we can no longer physically, at an affordable price point, get the parts needed to produce it because they're just so ancient. And so the U.S. is probably gonna have less. We're gonna have less flexibility going forward in terms of the volume of Stingers that we can provide to Ukraine, simply because we have nothing. We have Stingers and we have Patriot for it's available in quantity. We have some other systems that are currently coming online, but in terms of existing assets that we had in number, it's Stingers and Patriot, and that's it. So there's a minimum level of Stingers that we cannot drop below, because it would leave us very vulnerable in a number of areas. So that is potentially going to be a pressure point in the future.
It's funny that that Stinger is in such an important position considering how old it is. It's like having like grandpa as like your main line of defense. Oh man, it's just funny.
I mean, I'm not as well read on the doctrine of this as I should be, but in practice, kind of the forward air defense role has kind of fallen to the U.S. Air Force because, I mean, why wouldn't it? If you think about how the U.S. armed forces are structured, how they're intended to operate, the kind of conflicts they're expected to be engaged in, that really just makes sense in terms of the most cost-effective way from our standpoint to go about it. There's downsides to it, and that's why we're trying to address some of them, but the current war, Ukraine's needs are broadly unaligned or non-aligned with our industrial capabilities and our own force structure. And that obviously a lot of the issues that we've seen in terms of sustainment are just a natural function of that mismatch, of that misalignment between the capabilities and assets that we have and that we can sustain versus what Ukraine needs.
Even still, I think you should have a Stinger that's not like 50 years old or something.
I agree. The other issue with
Like,
Stinger,
even if it's literally just a Stinger made with modern parts, it would be a good idea.
well, the other issue with Stinger, and well, this is an issue with a number of man pads, including Stinger, is that it doesn't have night sights. It just has day sights. Pryyutne, the Polish man pads, which I think is basically just an overhaul Gigla. That's one of the nice things about it, is it does have night sights. That's a major issue with Stinger that we need to fix with the next production batches for the launchers. We need to put thermal images on them. We need to have actual night sights. That way you can actually engage stuff, during half the day, half of the 24 hours that constitutes a day.
Yikes. Anyways, this getting back to this S300, so it has a range of 80 kilometers or whatever, right? It was really at the edge of their range already, or unless this wasn't. Was this battery
Yep.
just for shooting down like cruise missiles? Like, is that what it's for?
Wait, can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Was this battery basically just shooting down cruise missiles?
So in terms of, well, it's not just about cruise missile defense. The reason why Ukrainian S-300P is deployed so close to the front is to keep Russian fixed-wing aircraft as far away from the front as possible, to minimize their ability to perform airstrikes, close air support, etc. It's to try and mitigate the asymmetric advantage that Russia has in the form of the VKS as much as possible.
Yeah. This was about 45 kilometers from the front, so it just seems that just looking at the little circle that I drew, it doesn't cover too much. It doesn't get into Kherson very far, like into the occupied territories, especially with respect to this other dot that we have right here, which is an airplane. This was a video of an airplane dropping a bomb. So you can kind of see like the blade is like all the way back here dropping the bomb. Whereas that this range is not even close to that airplane. So, and I'm not even sure like if you put it like on the river, maybe you could hit it. It's like these bombs are pretty long range apparently. So
Yeah. This is one of the many reasons why I continue to harp about the fact that Ukraine needs to be provided with additional Patriot batteries, because PAC-2 and GIM-T they range up to in the best case to 160 kilometers. If pushed to the front line, they could be at a safer distance in the Ukrainian rear and still project an anti-access area denial bubble deeper into the Russian rear than what's possible with Ukrainian S-300Ps.
yeah, it seems that 160, where that was, 160 seems like a good range, or maybe even more. I don't know, maybe like 200. I don't know.
Yeah. They need more than the two they have. What I've kind of been suggesting is U.S. needs to give 5 more, Europe needs to give 5 more, probably 2 to 3 from the Germans. one from Spain, one from somewhere else, and then Raytheon, I think, is supposed to deliver another 5 next year, new build.
So I have another weird question, but first I'm gonna ask a different question. Do they have the radars that can detect like these low observable planes or whatever? Are these even low observable? They're not. They're not actually low observable, are they?
What, the KH-101s?
I was just talking about their planes. I don't think they're just normal planes, aren't they?
The Russian ones?
Yeah.
The Su-57 is less observable, maybe, but
Yeah.
it has a radar cross section. Maybe it's on the low end for a 4th generation aircraft, but it's definitely observable to a meaningful extent.
But anyways, do we? So these systems would have the radar to see them. Okay, and my other weirder question is, like, if we wanted to, I'm not even saying we would, but if we wanted to, could we use our AWACS to like warn them about planes?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, no, not only we can do some wild stuff. What we can do, so just to give you an example, for Russian ballistic missiles, we have SBIRS, which is our space-based infrared surveillance system for early warning for ballistic missile launches. It has infrared and optical sensors, and its resolution is good enough to not only detect ballistic missile launches, but track them in flight, including post-boost phase, and with sufficient resolution to provide fire control data. That thing can see individual Russian SAMs fire. Like, whenever a Tor fires, the U.S. government sees it in almost real time. Whenever Russian MRL fires, we see it in almost real time. So, for example, if the Russians launch an Iskander-M or a Kinzhal, I mean, I'm pretty sure if we wanted to, I'm not 100% sure if this integration has actually been completed on our end for our own systems, but I know it's definitely something that has done a lot of serious work for at least for THAAD. There is the potential for Patriot, at least for PAC-3 CRI and PAC-3 MSE, that we could literally pass fire control data from our assets on orbit directly to Ukrainian Patriot batteries.
Do we have any limit on those missiles?
What do you mean?
On Patriot, like, is our stockpile big enough to supply Ukraine, or do we have to worry about how many missiles we have?
So for now we're okay. We built around 6,000 something, 6,700, I think, PAC-2/GMTs. We built around, I think, 1,000 or so PAC-3 CRIs, or PAC-3 and PAC-3 CRIs. We just now, a couple months ago, built the 1,000th PAC-3 MSE. We're going to be okay. The number of PAC-3 CRIs and MSEs that we can supply, there's probably going to be some limits on that. But the GMT stock, the PAC-2 and the GMT stocks, we can dig pretty deep into those. Like, our inventory is comparable to Russia's.
Nice.
Obviously there's downsides to that. If Ukraine is forced to rely mainly on PAC-2s, or GMTs for the most part, really, their magazine depth is going to drop pretty precipitously. So they're going to be less robust in large scale raids, and their ballistic missile defense capabilities are also going to atrophy fairly significantly because GMT is very, very meh at it. PAC-3 CRI and PAC-3 MSE are orders of magnitude more capable at intercepting ballistic missiles than GMT is.
Yeah, and they are the impacts, like they crash into the missile, right?
Yeah, so PAC-3 CRI, PAC-3 CRI, and PAC-3 MSE, those are all hit to kill, meaning they rely on kinetic impact of their target. For aerodynamic targets, they have, I believe, a 20 kilogram explosive charge called a lethality enhancer, but that isn't used against ballistic targets. PAC-2 and GMT, that's your traditional explosive warhead.
Okay.
And in terms, I see there's a question in the chat about production. We currently make 500 Pack 3 MSEs per year, and we have very low level production continuing for GMT for export customers for FMS, for military sales.
Yeah. So, but the stockpiles are that's a big stockpile. So, at least for the older ones.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyways, I guess I'm just gonna go through the news briefly because to be honest, the news today was not super interesting. So there's really not much to talk about. We talked about the missile raid. We talked about the missiles blowing up. There's this event going down in this kind of corner of Kherson where Russia's setting up a new schooling system that's required for children to be basically taught to be a Russian. It's like turn all the children into little Russian school. Anyways, I have nothing to say about this supposed river crossing. I've still not seen evidence that it's real. I've been looking. There's only evidence of shelling, and even that we have video showing that it's largely Ukrainian shelling, and we have drone footage showing the shelling. So even that, I'm not entirely convinced that was real. Second, so Robotyne. I don't know what just happened. Oh yeah, I drew a circle. Robotyne, we have evidence of Ukraine moving south to the east of the town, like halfway between Robotyne and Verbova. And in Robotyne itself, there was a video yesterday of Russia shelling this area of Robotyne, which made everybody say, "Oh, Ukraine captured the town," but then they forgot of the video of Ukraine shelling like half a block away. So there's just kind of this whole town is a gray area. Let's just put it that way. There's no actual evidence that Ukraine is capturing. Has captured the town yet, although it probably will happen soon, but it hasn't happened yet. We do have very solid evidence that Ukraine has taken this area to the west of the town, but they've probably did that a while ago. I mentioned that like 2 streams ago, I think. Moving on, Pryyutne is still they're still fighting north of the town in this gray area. There's no particular changes there. Urozhaine is still mostly a gray area, although about half under Ukrainian control. This gray area is difficult to enter because it's under basically constant shelling and bombing from rather large bombs, like 500, 1,000 kilogram bombs being dropped on it constantly. So nobody really wants to go there at the moment. And also, is there anything Ukraine can do to stop this bombing with what they have? Or do you just have to accept it?
What assets are the Russians primarily employing here? Sorry, I missed that.
These are like glide bombs.
Oh, the UMPKs, right.
Like, is there anything they can do? Or do you just have to accept it? Because there's like
Patriot close to the front line would help. It would make it riskier for them, for the VKS, the SU-34s, the fullbacks, to employ them. What you can do is, with something like Patriot fairly close to the front, you can do some combination of using its additional range compared to S-300P to both push the range at which they're going to be employing at further back from the front line. And more significantly, what you can do is you can force them to release at lower altitudes. That will reduce the range of the glide bomb. And you can also prevent them from loitering at high altitudes. So what the Ukrainians are currently forced to do now is, so with the JDAM ER, with those with the BSU, whatever the numerical code is for the Mark 82s, the 500-pound bombs. They have range for a high altitude release of around about 70 kilometers. Numbers very vague, hard to know specifics without having a specific altitude and release velocity or airspeed release figure attached to that. But in any case, roughly 70-kilometer range for a high altitude release. In practice, what the Ukrainians are doing is they're cruising in at fairly low altitude, popping up to around 6, 7, 8 kilometers, releasing, then dropping back down very, very quickly. With that approach in practice, they get about 40 kilometers of range out of them. So almost a 50% reduction in range compared to a high altitude release. You can, Ukraine being able to push Patriot forward to the front line would force a similar effect on the Russians and the UMPKs. It would be more dangerous for them to employ them, and they would get less range out of their UMPKs, and they might have to employ them from farther back. So it would probably decrease the volume, and the areas they can strike would be constrained to much, much closer along the actual forward edge of battle itself.
Yeah, and of course, this is the literal front line, so.
Yes. In terms of fixed wing, the Euro F-16s, I'm not sure how much they'd help in this regard. In principle, like, the latest F-16 variants, like the Block 70/72, in terms of their sensor and effector capabilities, they're absolutely monstrous compared to their VKS counterparts. But the Block 10 and Block 15 NLEUs that Ukraine would be likely receiving from Europe, on an individual basis, they are quantitatively inferior to the Su-35 in most respects. So I'm not sure how much they would help with this problem. I know that's a line that the Ukrainian Air Force is talking about quite a bit in terms of their, the public relations strategy, or their strategic communication strategy, I should say. But I'm not sure how much specifically, just due to the specific characteristics and capabilities of the older versions that they'd be getting. I don't know how much to help with this problem. Patriot would, if they had enough of them to reliably push some of them down to the front line, or at least certain portions of the front line.
Okay. Anyways, so that's Urozhaine. It's getting bombed. Basically, Russia is going to blow up every building there and then admit defeat. I think that's pretty much their plan at this point. In Marinka, there's still everyday fighting as per usual. Near Pisky and Pervomaiske, Russia went on a little offensive here. Ukraine did their kind of usual thing where they kind of abandoned their forward positions, pull back, let Russia move forward. Russia, shot this position here with a toss, blew up a whole bunch of trees. Anyways, they kind of draw Russia in with their tanks and then engage them with whatever anti-tank missiles they have, javelins or Stugnas or whatever. Once they draw the tanks in, they've repeatedly done this. This is not the first time Russia's attacked, and Russia has not been able to successfully attack here. They've done a number of attacks coming from the south. They've come kind of from over here, kind of wrapping up. They've come directly from the south, like this time. They've also tried crossing the field from the east. They've tried moving through the town and then cutting down that way. Russia's tried this attack a whole bunch of times. Ukraine's defense has always been to basically, they have a bunch of light infantry out here. When the light infantry sees tanks coming, they pull back, pull the tanks in, tanks get blown up, and that's the attack. And that's basically what happens. In Andiivka, there's still, general fighting going on. It's mostly on this side of the city now, not so much the western side. where Russia spent, I don't know, like 2 or 3 months trying to move up this western side of the city to enter this part over here, this little micro district, but it failed. And now they're trying to do it on the eastern side, and it's not succeeding. I don't know why they even attack Avdiivka anymore. It's a total waste of time. But moving on up, in the Kurdiumivka and Andriivka area, Russia tried their little counterattack where yesterday we saw results of their attack, which ended up with a bunch of destroyed T-90Ms, a few BMP-2s, and MTLBs and other such vehicles. It did not go well for them. They took pretty high casualties in this counterattack, and it didn't really achieve much. They counterattacked both Klishchiivka and out of Andriivka. There have been numerous videos of T-90s. They tend to start back here. They move through Andriivka, kind of move up to this tree line, and then pull back. And yesterday, I believe it was when they were pulling back, they lost 3 T-90s here. Although it may have been in the initial attack, I'm not really sure. They also did the same sort of thing where they pushed a few T-90s up into Klishchiivka right around here, and I don't actually know the what resulted to those tanks, but they did not capture the town, so I'm not really not really worried about those tanks. These drone attacks here, I'm not sure if these videos are new or not. It strikes me as footage that they didn't want to release until they controlled the area, but I'm not sure about that. So these are Ukrainian drone videos, but I didn't change the area of control because I'm not sure if they're new. And all this area to the north, I have very little information. I updated my map the other day on Russian control in this little rail section of the rail tracks. It's not terribly important. I think Ukraine withdrew because all the trees were destroyed and their trenches no longer had overhead cover, so they withdrew, and Russia is now in a bunch of trenches with no overhead cover and getting hit by drones and stuff. To the north, I clarified, this is near Svatove, I clarified the Russian line here. They control this kind of little all these little trees. Anyway, so I clarified that. It's not super important. It was a map change. You can probably see the before and after clarification. This is what changed in the map. Reality didn't change. It was only the map that changed. Okay, and up towards Kuzymivka, Russia is still trying to attack south of Novoselivska, moving towards Stelmahivka. They've made no progress. They've also been attacking this town that I don't remember how to pronounce, I'm not going to try. And they've also been attacking Andriivka from the south, all with no progress. And in the north, near Sinkivka, Russia did advance out of Vil'Shana a little bit. It's not terribly important at the moment, as I've said in the past, and I will mark it again right now. This blue line here is the Ukrainian defensive line. Everything north of it doesn't really matter. This is the line that matters. Russia's not reached it yet, so there's nothing to be worried about. And that's the news today. It's not terribly interesting, which is why we talked about other things most of the time. And I think that is the stream for today. We've been going for over 2 hours. So I think that's it. Thank you for everybody for coming and listening, and I'll be back on Friday. And thank you to John for coming and talking to us about missiles. And thank you to Lorem Ipsum and talking to us about economics. Thank you. And to Exit, who's been quiet for a while. Thank you to you too. All right, so I'm going to stop the stream now. Goodbye.